So we're just posing for a photo, and now I'm going to start. So, good afternoon. I'm Ben Rich. I'm Chief Executive of RADIX. We call ourselves a Radical Centre think tank. By radical, we mean we're concerned with system change, big things that make a difference. And by centre, we don't mean politically centre. We mean we are independent and mainstream. And do go and grab some information from our stand just downstairs in the bar. So it's been an interesting 18 months. Who's joined a new WhatsApp group with neighbours or street in the last 18 months? Yeah. About half. Who's registered formally to volunteer with either the NHS or local authority? Yeah. And who's done shopping for neighbours or had shopping bought for them for neighbours or picked up prescriptions? Yeah, so that's a fairly typical room. It looks to me like it's about half of you, and we know that during COVID, about half of us have volunteered, which is staggering. There have been 4,000 new mutual aid groups set up during COVID, and I've joined the Sandringham Street WhatsApp group with my neighbours, even though I've never talked to most of them before. So there's been this massive upturn in community support, and it's really made a difference. But I know that's happened in middle class areas like where I live. Is that universal? Does it look different from area to area? And has it continued after that first lockdown? Did we carry on doing that? Has government helped that process? And when I talk about government, I mean national government and local government. Has it helped or actually got in the way? And how do we continue that social capital we've discovered into the future? So these are the questions which I was thinking about very much based on my experience, and led me to speak to a group of 7 MPs from a variety of different constituencies and areas, and I asked them to tell me what had happened in their area. And we've released or pre-released today, because we've not yet published, this book, which hopefully you'll find on your chairs or at the back when you are leaving. And there's a series of different essays in this where MPs talk about what they've seen happening locally to them. Now, this is the start of a process, not the end, because what I want to do is take these experiences and feed them into a commission we're going to set up and ask much more broadly, how do we capture that community spirit? And so you're going to hear today from 3 of our essayists. You're also going to hear from Taiwo, the MP for Coventry Northwest, about what was the experience in this city. But then I really, really want to hear from you. I want to hear what your experiences have been and your ideas to capture the community spirit. As ever, by now you probably know how to use Slido, slido.com. The details will be up on the screen, I imagine, at some stage. And please do use that. But just to get us going, this whole project started with a conversation with a Conservative MP called Danny Kruger, who worked in the number 10 policy unit and who wrote a paper for Boris Johnson on how we capture community spirit. And so I think it's only fair to start with his contribution. He couldn't be with us in person, but we're going to start with his video contribution in 5 minutes, if we can play that.
Well, I'm very pleased to be with RADIX and grateful to you for organising today, and sorry not to be there in person, but I'm grateful for the opportunity to participate and to have written the essay as one of a number of colleagues contributing to what I hope will be a useful set of suggestions and learnings and lessons from the last year and a half that will take us forward. And I have three big, simple thoughts that I think we can take from the crisis. We've so much went wrong, so much should have been done better. We can see that at all levels. But there were three really positive things that happened. One was a lot of businesses responded in a really positive way to the crisis that they found their communities in, and we've got used to becoming critical of businesses which serve distant shareholders and don't seem to have the right concern for their people, their customers, or the local environment. And actually, we've seen businesses stepping forward in a really positive way, going the extra mile to support their staff, obviously helped by the furlough scheme, but taking the extra step where they can. Stepping in, filling gaps created by the crisis in terms of supporting communities, particularly as the amazing stepping forward that catering companies did and restaurants did in those times and half-term holidays when we were worried about hunger among children, as an example. I think we've seen an indication of the sort of business model that we could have if businesses working with communities, with government, are able to act in a really collaborative way, think about a wider set of stakeholders than just their shareholders. And particularly, I think the role of social enterprises is crucial. We see how social enterprises operate in a long-term way. They invest in their staff, they recycle profits into the community. They're often based in places where commercial enterprises are thin on the ground. So we see really positive steps taken by businesses, and I'd like to see more of that. The second big lesson is about the way the public sector has worked. Again, big failures, no doubt, at all levels, but something really positive happened as well that we've seen, particularly locally. Public services, councils, the NHS, other parts of the public sector, working collaboratively, outwardly, flexibly, and not in a bureaucratic and siloed way, and being responsive to the immediate needs of local people, and working particularly with community groups. That's what I was so inspired by in Wiltshire, at least, and I know it's happened nationally. And that's the third thing that I think we can learn, and the biggest lesson of all, which is the way our communities themselves have responded to this crisis. We are very used to, and it's a legitimate and very real anxiety that we have in our country, in our culture at the moment, is about loneliness, isolation, the separation of people from each other, the social divisions that we have, the lack of cohesion. And yet, in a crisis like the one we've had, we see the potential of our communities to act together and to support each other and for people to support their neighbours. And I mean, from the day one, from day -6, in fact, in Devizes in Wiltshire, we saw the local church, St James's Church, mobilise hundreds of volunteers a week before the first lockdown was announced. So when the lockdown hit, all the local council had to do was to support and endorse and facilitate and help resource this amazing community effort that we've seen. And that's been a national phenomenon. So never let it be said that we don't have strong community ties, that we don't have a spirit of neighbourliness. We really do. It just needs to be brought forward and given expression. So how do we take all this forward? Well, that's the challenge for us as politicians and for local government, and particularly for community groups themselves. And I think there's a whole range of lessons we've learned and mechanisms that we can introduce, from a big volunteer passport system that I think we need to have, to better use of data and digital, to tax breaks and support, financial support for community initiatives like this, different ways of working by local authorities and public services. But fundamentally, we need a culture change that recognises the central importance of civil society, social infrastructure, of the places of gathering and belonging that bring us together and enable us to do work together. And I hope that what we've seen in this collection of essays and in this event is an indication that across politics, we are united in that idea that we can work together and our communities have real power and real strength. So I'm grateful again for the opportunity to take part, and I look forward to the influence that I hope this collection of essays will have. Thank you.
So that was Danny Kruger's viewpoint, and it's interesting that it seems to me that his party allegiance is entirely irrelevant in that, and I saw lots of nodding around the room. And so rather than leap straight back onto video, I think and come back to one of our essays, I think I'd like to hear what happened here and what those experiences were. So I'm going to introduce Taiwo Owatemi, who is the MP for Coventry North West, and Taiwo, I'm more comfortable on the stage, I don't know why. Taiwo's been a fantastic supporter of Big Tent, by the way. She's was here yesterday opening our summit, and we've loved having you here. And I thought, I wish I'd known you when we were putting the essays together, because I'd love to have had you write for us, but I do know you now, and so you will write for us in the future. Meanwhile, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you everyone for choosing to attend today's session. I really do hope that we're able to have some meaningful discussions and come up with ideas on how we move forward. Earlier this week, when I was taking the time to think about how I was going to address the question that was going to be posed today, the question of how did the pandemic help to recapture or fracture community spirit? It became immediately obvious to me that during the pandemic, without any doubt, the community here in Coventry had all come together and we were all united in helping the most vulnerable within our society. I had had the opportunity to witness, and I'm sure we all witnessed, an enormous outpouring of civic pride and a willingness for neighbours to go the extra mile to support and care for one another. But the more I started to think about it, the more I started to ask myself the question again, it occurred to me that something had broken. And during this pandemic, a change did occur. Now that change, it wasn't community spirit that had broken. It wasn't a willingness to get involved that had broken. It was some of the cynicism, some of the fears that had formed over the years, particularly about our public institutions, about our local public services and our concerns about them. And one of the concerns that people had was about our NHS. And as a healthcare worker, it's something that I often heard from people. And people were concerned that the NHS often was that it was overwhelmed, that it was overstretched, and that if a major issue like the pandemic happened, it wouldn't be able to cope. Now, the one thing that we all know over the past 18 months is that Coventry, University Hospital Coventry did a fantastic job. You know, all the healthcare heroes that worked in our local hospital were fantastic. They were a great pillar to Coventry's community, and they showed the strength that existed within Coventry as a community. Never once did they ever break under the stress of the pandemic, or did they ever express any difficulty in addressing the complex health challenges that we're still facing today. And for anybody who hasn't actually seen the BBC documentary, I would actually recommend it. It was a wonderful documentary, and it showcased just the hard work of the healthcare professionals here in Coventry. But apart from our NHS, we also saw similar contributions within the care system. We saw many carers making the sacrifices to look after their patients. Many of them that I spoke to in my local constituency chose to spend time there and actually tell their family that, you know, that they weren't unable to be there all the time. And some people actually gave their kids to their friends and their families to look after so they could spend more time looking after their patients and providing that family that many patients were unable to have during the pandemic due to the lockdown restrictions. But another fear that was dispelled during the pandemic, and one that I heard many times, was that teachers and teaching assistants would also not be able to teach our children during, if they weren't meeting in traditional settings of being in a physical building. And I know that for many of the casework that I had, people were asking how was it going to work and what we're going to do to impact, to ensure that it doesn't impact education of young people. And it was a concern that I myself had. And I have to admit that it wasn't easy. I have to admit that many teachers had to overcome difficulties to be able to continue to teach our loved ones. But they did an amazing job. Teachers from across Coventry, either it was Bongate Primary School, my constituency, all the way to Camden Court Secondary School in the constituency, worked extra hours. You know, they had to master what it was like to teach online. Many of them that I spoke to tailored their teaching to meet the needs of students, which is not easy and which involves a lot of time and dedication. And most importantly, a lot of the stories that I heard was that they provided that mental health support that students needed during a difficult time. And that really helped to ensure that Coventry's 57,000 students did not fall behind during their education. And I know it's something that they're still working on. So as well as deconstructing the fears and the cynical attitude that the pandemic had led to, communities in Coventry found innovative ways of caring for one another. And an example that really spoke to me personally was the way that we responded to feeding Coventry's children during the pandemic. At normal times, schools provide children with free school meals. And unfortunately, during the pandemic, when doors were shut, many of the students were left unable to access the healthy meals in which they relied on. But actually, in their place, what we saw was a network of volunteers, people who were really ready to step up and to meet that need locally, even when national efforts regrettably felt a bit too short. And what I saw for myself was also how social supermarkets made and dispensed thousands of lunches to our poorest school children, and building on the heroic efforts of Coventry Food Bank and our brilliant charity, Langer Aid. And just to make a point about Langer Aid didn't just provide food to those in need in Coventry. They went as far as Dover to provide meals to lorry drivers who were experiencing delays due to the complications that came with COVID. And that just shows how dedicated the community here in Coventry is to helping those in need. Just going back to schools, at the same time, what I also saw was teachers going out every day, delivering meal parcels to students, the most vulnerable students who needed it, to ensure that they were able to provide that wraparound care that students really needed. Now, as Danny has said earlier, one of the biggest issues that we all faced as a community, and here in Coventry that I heard from many people, was the issue of isolation. And just at the edge of my constituency, there is a community group which started an initiative called the Summer of Sunflowers. Now, the Summer of Sunflowers is a very interesting project. So what the project aims to do is to encourage people to grow sunflowers in their garden. And it was a very simple idea, but it was a very brilliant idea. And the way it works is that it gave neighbours the opportunity to speak together, to work on a shared project and to strike new conversations. And it helped tackle the issues of loneliness, the issues of isolation that plagued many of us during the pandemic. And when I went out there to visit different people to speak about how they found the Summer Sunflower, the one thing I heard from many of their neighbours was that the activity, being involved in that community project, allowed them to get to know one another. It allowed them to forge relationships which they never had a year and a half ago, and it helped build a lasting relationship in their neighbourhood, which I'm sure will continue to last even once the pandemic is over. This outpouring of care was heartwarming and fortified our community during a trying time. But in addition to that, just looking at the celebration of City of Culture and how everyone's come together, and even speaking to some of the hosts here today when I was coming, it shows that Coventry really just has a united spirit, a spirit that is based on volunteering and being able to contribute to the community. I remember just looking and speaking to people about the opening broadcast ceremony that happened. And this ceremony for the City of Culture was broadcasted on different radio stations, and it was broadcast on telly as well. And what I heard from people was that it brought their families together. It brought people to come visit their neighbours. It meant that people were coming out in their front lawns having conversations. It meant people were able to come together after 18 months to be able to listen to live music, to be able to herald in the City of Culture. So I would say to anyone who have concluded that the pandemic broke our community spirit and that the community spirit in Britain was torn apart during the pandemic, I would generally say to them, just come visit Coventry, and Coventry would show to you just what it means to have such a strong, powerful community spirit. Now, while the pandemic has indeed been very devastating and has posed some unprecedented challenges to all of us, it also has dispelled the misplaced views that our cherished public services and institutions are not what they were once. So this is surely something that we can all be proud of, and I hope that everyone here in this room is proud of it. And in Coventry, it has also meant that new and innovative ways of caring for one another has truly flourished. So I do sincerely hope that this sense of optimism of what we've all achieved over the past 18 months, this sense of community, does not despair. and instead is nurtured. And as the MP and as the local MP, I will do all that I can to continue to nurture it because it's so great to see. Thank you.
I think that's really interesting because whilst you've done what all the essayists have done, which is what was important, you've talked about the response to COVID and the Sunflower Project, and some of those are really interesting. Actually, you also talked about City of Culture, and that seems to me really interesting because that isn't about COVID. And that clearly has been a time, I mean, I just need to look around at all the people in blue vests, a time when people have come forward to volunteer. And I'd love to hear actually from the people in blue vests, whether it was that it was the City of Culture. I'm looking at you because you're the only person I can see with a blue vest. But I'd love to hear from you in a minute whether you came forward because of something that happened during COVID or something that happened during the City of Culture, or simply you were bored. But why are you here? So that would be my question to you in a minute. And therefore, whether there are other things we can do to catalyse that sort of behaviour is really interesting. I want to hear that from lots of people. Before I do, I'm going to ask George, who, among all the other things that he's been doing at this festival, still found time, and not just at this festival, but endless amounts of energy that comes out of George, still found time to write an essay for us on his experiences of his mid-Norfolk constituency. And George, I'd be really pleased to hear from you briefly what happened there and what you thought worked and didn't.
Thank you, Ben. And can I just take an opportunity to thank Ben for putting together? He's done all the work putting the programme for this festival together, and I think he deserves a round of applause. I'm actually, not for the first time, not going to do what Ben's asking. It's a brilliant pamphlet. Please read it. And I have written in it 3 case studies of how COVID has triggered phenomenal coming togetherness, including in my constituency. But I want to answer the other bit of the question, which is, Taiwo, what you talked on, how do we harness this spirit going forward? And I think I want to sort of suggest to you that the pandemic has been the most painful, I mean, 120,000 of our fellow citizens have died, painful and tragic wake-up call, reminder that we are genuinely all in this together. And as a global community, this pandemic has swept across the entire globe and tested the resilience of every institution, from the global economy to every individual, in a simultaneous test. And surely one of the fundamental lessons is the togetherness on which we all rely ultimately. And I sense, but maybe it's just the optimist in me, but I don't think so. I sense that people really want to get rid of this disease, and they really want to harness that spirit of, imagine what we could do if we just all did a little bit more and nurtured that sense of togetherness. And at a global level, I think it's been a massive wake-up call for global health resilience, which is why I've been working to set up a Global Health Resilience Commission to make sure that the rich nations realise we're only as safe and secure as our investment in disease prevention globally. But in villages in Norfolk, people have realised that actually when they were called upon to deliver the box, 500,000 people in this country signed up within like 2 weeks and said, I want to help. And I think a bit like London 2012, it was wonderful that we won all the medals, but it was also wonderful that there were so many of those volunteers. Do you remember the games makers? They were almost the most special bit about London 2012, that everywhere across our country, people put on the jacket, represented their country's best spirit of hospitality and welcome. So the question I want to pose to myself and to you all is, how can we as policymakers create some mechanisms for that latent capacity of people to give much, much more to the people and places they love than they'll ever give to government, or that government can ever give? And I say that as someone, I'm not a little state Tory, I'm not a slash the state small, I believe in government. But I also think as a sailor that the government looks sometimes like an aircraft carrier from a dinghy. And we've seen a lot of images of refugees in boats drifting across the Med and across the Channel, seeking sanctuary and refuge. And government often looks like an aircraft carrier. It's daunting, it's huge, it has slippery sides, you don't know how to get on board, There are no rope ladders, and on the top are a bunch of people making really important decisions that will shape your future. And I think the big challenge for anyone, all of us involved in government, is how do we create a world where thousands of little sailing boats can flourish happily? How do we unleash that power of people in communities to really make a difference? And I think there's a big idea taking hold, and I want to use the 2 minutes I've got left to suggest what it is to you.
30 seconds.
And the idea is social enterprise. We talk a lot about private sector, public sector, and third sector, charities. There's a fourth sector called social enterprise. The Big Tent has spawned a couple. And social enterprise, for those of you who are not familiar with the notion, is for profit. They're businesses that generate a profit and then put the profit back into the cause that drives them on. We've spawned a project called the Bridge of Hope, which is a social enterprise helping to take the most vulnerable, hard to reach and disadvantaged job seekers, who are very easy for employers not to employ, hold their hand and introduce them to enlightened employers who want to give them a chance. Enlightened employers like Timpson's, by the way, who've recognized that those most damaged, vulnerable, are the most grateful for work, and they tend to have much higher retention rates, much higher loyalty rates, much higher resilience rates. And so the Bridge of Hope is placing people into work. Imagine if the government said, look, we want to drive healthier and cleaner growth. Imagine if we, by the places that people love, whether it's city or county or whatever it is, we took a place and we said, look, guys, this is what disease is costing us. Obesity, dementia, diabetes, bad social care system. It's going up every year. It's bankrupting us. Or take it the other way. This is what high carbon growth is costing us in pollution, in congestion. If you can help reduce the cost of that, or reduce the rate of growth of increase, we'll let you keep some of the saving. I think what would happen is that a lot of people would say, did he just say we could keep some of the saving? What kind of numbers are we talking about? Well, I'll tell you, the cost of obesity in the West Midlands, the obesity capital of Europe, by the way, because successive governments have built a car economy, and we've built an economy based on people living on garage food, sweet drinks, sitting, taking their exercise, pumping out particulates, and sitting in congestion, and called it growth. Here in the West Midlands, the Treasury have calculated, God bless their cotton socks, it costs 4 billion a year. I don't know whether that's right or wrong. It's probably wrong, but let's take it because it's the Treasury's figure, so they won't disagree. 4 billion a year is the cost of obesity in the West Midlands. Imagine if you were able to reduce that number here and keep, let's open the bidding at half the saving. If you had it written down, if it was in law. I suspect that Ben Braben and Mark Essex and various of others, in fact, I think everyone in this room would say, did he just say we could keep half the saving? I don't mean to buy a Porsche. I mean to put it back into our city. 1,000 flowers would bloom and social enterprises would pop up saying, I can reduce the cost of obesity because once I'm promised that we'll get £20 million in 3 years, I can borrow money, I can build bike routes, I can give people Fitbits, I can start to... And I think the challenge is for government to create those incentives for place-based social enterprises to do what government isn't very good at doing. We're terrible at running a prison service that stops people reoffending. We're terrible at running addictions services. There's various things government tries, but we're terrible. People could do it for their places so much better, save the government a fortune, and guess what? They'd be happier for it. Because in our hearts, what we all want to do really is give a little to make a big difference. Yeah. Government makes that almost impossible. Social enterprises make it not just possible, but fulfilling and profitable for everyone involved. So I suggest that the social enterprise revolution is the one that's coming. And part of our ambition as the Big Tent is to support it by changing policy, but also nurturing a new generation of social entrepreneurs like you, sir. Funding you, training you, empowering you, mentoring you, and sponsoring projects. Wouldn't that be an amazing thing as a legacy from COVID?
Thank you, George. And,
That was brilliant.
I want to hear from Layla Moran, who was our third SS, but I'm going to park her because she's not in the room, so she won't know. And instead, I want to hear from you. We've begun to get a couple of solutions. We've got actually the value of the City of Culture, of the space-based initiative that drove volunteering. We've got George's place-based social enterprises. Are those things you've got experiences of? Are they things which have worked for you, worked not? Whilst you're thinking, I'm going to tell you just two very, very brief examples, but I want you to be thinking, and if you'd like to speak, come and sit at the front so that we can put you on the microphone. So be doing that whilst I give you two examples. I did talk about the Sandringham Street WhatsApp group. That led to us last summer, when we were finally able to, as a street for the very first time, having a party in the middle of the street for no particular reason. And we all bought our food and we all sat outside our houses and ate our own food. But we talked and we caught up with Lorna, who's we discovered that we'd all been collecting medicines for, and paracetamol, and she must have a massive stack of paracetamol because she couldn't have been using it all, but it was the reason that we all talked to her. And so that was a really good experience. And then my second experience was as volunteering for my local authority, or remain nameless. I signed up to volunteer, and it took them a good 6 weeks to ask me to do something, and eventually they asked me to go and knock on 3 doors. So I loyally went out and knocked on my 3 doors to check on people. And only one of them was in. And that one person said, "You're the 3rd person to come and knock on my door." And so I stopped doing that. So where does that sit with your own experiences? And is there somebody who'd like to just kick off this process? Because I'm not certain whether it's difficult. Aha, thank you. Come and use this mic.
I was... Hello. Oh, amazing. Yeah, you're right. That is a lot louder. I was going to ask that... so all of the things that Taiwo talked about in Coventry are absolutely true. I think we've been brilliant. I mean, you talked to anyone in Coventry. I really feel that's true. My kind of question is, where do you draw the line between something that the community gets involved in? I think we would all think that in any possible system, any possible distribution of wealth, or any possible government, there would be community enterprise. But how do you differentiate between community enterprise, which is the best possible way of doing it, and community enterprise that is only happening because of some failure? Like, is it that government can't do good prisons, or is it that our government is choosing not to do good prisons? And so that I don't fully understand from the talk so far how we would make sure we're getting the best possible value, and that people have the time and the energy to put into things that are going to make the most difference. That's the question I'd like to ask.
Okay. So I'm going to take a few comments, and then I'm going to come back to George and Taiwo. Is there anybody else who wants to come up? Please come up. Whilst you're coming up, I'm going to say to one of the people in the blue shirts at the back, I'm going to ask you to come and tell us why you're here, why you volunteered. But yeah. So now is the moment to reassign yourself somewhere else. Oh.
Don't go.
We just finished our shift.
Excellent. So you're free to participate in my section.
It's a very simple question, actually. It seemed that you were describing social impact bonds, essentially. You know, social change, a certain prize for it, whoever achieves that. The problem is outcome attribution. How do you know when obesity goes down, which social enterprise was responsible, et cetera? It might be easier for a prison. After all, you were inside a building, someone owns it. But a little bit harder for these sort of more general, diffuse social phenomena. So I was just curious how you would actually do that attribution.
Okay. So, excellent. You're coming through. Fantastic. Unfortunately, I can't.
There we go.
First, can I say that Big Tent wouldn't be happening without you guys. So thank you very much for being here. I don't know if it's easier for me to lift the microphone down to you, or how you want to.
I'm sure they can hear me. Can you all hear me at the back?
It'll come out.
Probably.
Yeah.
It will come down. There we go.
I can't steer at all. Much as I'd love to. Actually, funny enough, I'm off duty.
Okay.
So, but I did a shift this morning,
and why? Why did you volunteer to be City of Culture Champion?
Gosh, I could be here all night and all day and whatever. COVID, definitely.
Okay.
Because it's a catalyst. So we've come out of the crisis. hopefully, and we could have just sat at home and thought, well, feel sorry for ourselves. But what a wonderful opportunity, the City of Culture, won the bid. And then I thought, you know, city host, is it worth volunteering because of all the stress going out? But suddenly you do your first shift, you meet people, and then you see what a wonderful city this is. And I mean, talk about going through the mill. Obviously, I'm a Coventry City supporter.
That must be a very depressing
It
life.
certainly is. But Coventry are back home, and without Coventry City back at Kiko and the Rico, that wouldn't have made the City of Culture. But experiences with COVID, I mean, it's going to be a bit controversial, but I do agree with all the community spirit in Coventry. Where I live on the London Road, which is half a mile away, absolutely no help whatsoever.
Okay.
And I was banging stuff through the COVID groups, through the councillors. It was like it didn't exist.
Okay.
And the main reason behind that is you had this overall COVID group, which are great, you know, the COVID Facebook groups. But the ward I'm in, St Michael's, someone unfortunately decided to take that. And I kept wondering, why is these people St Michael's? I don't recognise them. Then I found out it was St Michael's ward in Stoke-on-Trent. And as you know, if you all had COVID groups, the first thing you do was go to your COVID group and the organisation. But having said that, one of the things, and it's taught me in life, when you've got a disability, you've got to get on with it. No good feeling, sympathy, just got to get on with it. And in fact, because we didn't have a COVID group, and I've got elderly neighbours, I was the COVID group.
Brilliant.
And they didn't understand how to get food, go online, etc., etc.
So you were very driven by COVID, but the experience has given you a chance to meet other people in the city and
Absolutely.
Right.
And is everyone here from Coventry or?
people be from all over.
Yeah. And I'm going to give a plug to BBC Coventry Warwickshire, because since Trish is creeping up.
You're on, Trish.
It is, yeah.
So thank you.
Yeah.
So I didn't catch your name.
Ian Oakley.
Ian, thank you, Ian. That's really, really helpful. And that's what I wanted to try and understand. I'm going to come back to the panel, and Taiwo, do you want to respond to Ian or to the points that have been made from the floor about how you make certain that social enterprises are not just stepping in for the failures of government?
Ian, I would just say that it's really great to see you participating as a volunteer, and it's great to see just how driven and motivated you are. And I do apologise for some of the challenges that you faced during the pandemic. And afterwards, I'll come over just to have a chat to see what support we can provide.
Well, you're not my MP,
No, I'm
so-
not. No, I'm not. But
It's a shame, to be honest.
we're all one Coventry community,
Yeah.
so more than happy.
It wasn't for lack of trying. So.
I am sorry to hear that.
But no, I'm not knocking. You know, obviously that's what's happened. That's history.
Mm.
You know, we've got to get on with it and have a wonderful year as a City of Culture.
Absolutely, and I hope that you enjoy being a volunteer and
I'm
get
still-
involved.
I'm still here.
Yes.
And that's amazing, isn't it?
Well, thank you, a pleasure. And just going back to the first question that was asked in terms of whether or not the government won't, or is it that they can't? I'll say in certain institutions and in certain cases, it's about how willing they are to ensure that institutions are properly funded. And I think a good example is mental health. Mental health, it's great that we have many charities and many community groups who are willing to provide that mental health support. But actually, in many cases, people need specialised healthcare professionals. And what they need so desperately is that funding from local government is able to meet that need. And that is definitely a challenge in which the government has to step up to. And it's something that we, as a community, but also as politicians, have to constantly ensure that the government understands the challenges that are facing people in the community. And there has to be a policy change as to how they prioritise these funding opportunities. But I would say that it's incredible the work that charities and community groups are doing to be able to overcome those challenges, despite some of the shortfalls from the government.
Okay. George, I'm going to come to you in just a second, but I'm conscious I'm going to be timed out of giving Layla her say, and I must do that. So can we play the video for Layla Moran, who's the MP for Oxford West and Abingdon? And here's what she had to say.
Hello, Big Tent Festival. My name's Layla Moran and I'm the MP for Oxford, West and Abingdon. And I want to tell you a bit about my contribution to the book Together Again, that's been pulled together by parliamentarians and people who were involved in the response to the pandemic. And in particular, I want to highlight the local response in Oxfordshire. Now, I'm a Liberal Democrat, and we believe, and always have believed, that locally led is best. And I don't think that there could have been a more complex, more stratospheric issue that the country has dealt with than this pandemic. But when it came to the on-the-ground response, I think we can all agree that the response of our communities was incredible. There were WhatsApp groups set up. There were food banks that were either grown or set up from scratch. And it was an enormous joy to go and support those grassroots organisations as the local MP. But as they grew, and there were so many, that there were even groups that were set up to coordinate the groups, it also became clear that unless these groups were joined up with our local councils, that actually we risked some very vulnerable groups who wouldn't perhaps engage with these community groups, who would fall through the cracks. And so the Vale of Whitehorse District Council really stepped up to the mark. And in my essay, I talk about how they did it. First of all, they were very keen to encourage the groups, not to take over and not to say we know best. But they also identified that there were some aspects that were potentially problematic. And the two most obvious of those are safeguarding, of which many of the community groups didn't have direct experience, and also data sharing. How could the councils, who were part of a national structure of gold, silver, bronze, and they were being shared the official data by the Department for Work and Pensions and the Department for Health, for who was vulnerable, how could they ensure that those groups' needs were being met and joined up with the right community groups at the same time? The councils also brought not just expertise in those areas, but also resource, and in particular, the resource of being able to call hundreds of people at any one time and being able to keep track of the enormous amounts of data that were being generated. They came to the point, and I remember these conversations with the Vale, where they were just moving people off desks of non-essential work. For example, planning suffered a backlog. And you'd think, well, during a pandemic, that might happen because people were redesigning their houses. Well, actually, in the case of the Vale, it was partly because town planners were being asked to be part of call centres to help respond to the coronavirus response. And it was also deeply frustrating that the government didn't seem to want to trust councils from the off. Many times they would hear an announcement that they were directly involved in trying to deliver at the 5 p.m. press conference, when the Prime Minister was already answering the questions for how they were going to do it. And meanwhile, council leaders, chief execs and officers were on the phone to each other going, what have they just said? What is it we have to do now? The consequences of this incredible work that councils did with the local communities is some positive. It worked, and where it worked well, where it was joined up, I genuinely believe that our residents, and especially the most vulnerable residents, got a better service. But the other side to it is that we are now left with enormous financial black holes in council funding. And when people are seeking to return back to normal after this pandemic, I hope that some of the legacy of this is first and foremost, they'll remember how the community came together, how people rallied around one another, and how they said, I'm not going to step back and protect myself, I'm going to go into the fray and help other people. But that also the critical part that local councils played in making sure that all of that was joined up and worked and that no one was left behind. So as we now move into this post-pandemic world, I hope that the lesson to government will be listen to councils. They are close to the ground. They know their communities. Don't see them as a barrier. Don't see them as something that you can just direct either. They should be a partner in government decision making. And if you want programs to be effective and for local communities to be involved in a really meaningful way, there is no better way of engaging those communities than through local councils like the Vale of Whitehorse. So I hope you enjoy the essay. I've really enjoyed writing it. And I hope you enjoy the book and indeed the entire festival. Thank you.
So that's Layla Moran. And I think, again, the point that she raises, the question she raises about the level at which we take decisions is hugely important. And I would really love some feedback on that. Trish, you were wanting to come in, I think.
Oh, yeah, just quickly. Hello, everybody.
Come and use the mic. I know you've got a loud voice.
Hello. Hello. I'm talking as Trish, a mom, not Trish the journalist. George, absolutely fantastic. I've been listening to conversations around today. What you've done here is absolutely incredible. Absolutely. So, you know, full praise, just as not as a BBC journalist, but just as a mom and a person from Coventry. Thank you. Yeah. Just very quickly, you mentioned about volunteering. A very quick story I just want to share with you. I'm involved with a local voluntary group that try and help knife crime just because I'm related to the person who's involved in it. But yesterday, I was in a very, very tough area of Coventry as a volunteer. And it was an area that not many people go into because they fear a lot of the issues there. And just very quickly, the power of volunteering, and well done to our city hosts. There was an incident where the volunteers started to help the young people play football. And all these young people started to emerge and started to play football. Everyone was laughing, everyone was smiling. And then a fully grown man came out of nowhere and said to these young 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds, get out of our hood, get out of our space. You don't belong here. And I was amazed at the volunteers who just stood there and said, no, this is our city. We belong here. No one tells us where to go in Coventry, particularly as we're helping young people. And I am telling you, the power of that yesterday, I wanted to share with you, because we can reclaim our streets. We will. There is more of us than there is of them. And this big man who just stood there while these kids were looking and said, get off, get out of our area. And these young people said, no. Just to see the look on the faces of those young people was incredibly powerful. And honestly, I was so scared because I thought it's going to kick off. There's going to be there's going to be a police incident, and they stood their ground calmly. So my message is the power of volunteering. I used to be one of those people, me, myself, I. Yeah, my job, my money, my life. That's bollocks. We have to work together and work. You know what? That's why city hosts like Ian and all the team here, I salute you, because you don't just talk the talk, you walk the walk. And my message here is just really, please, I'm not being paid today. I'm here voluntary. I'm not being paid whatever. I'm saying to you, if it's the one thing you take away from, the power of volunteering, because I'll tell you this now, those young kids who were like 7 and 8 years old, 9 years old, were looking up to those 18 and 20-year-olds, and they were really grateful for them. And this guy and the people turned on this guy and said, shut up, leave them alone. So all I'm saying to you is I want to share that with you. I was so blown away. George, well done.
Thank you so much. And thank you for sharing that example. That's really, really great. Look, we're really out of time, but I promised I would give George just to come back. George, you know as well as I do how important it is this all runs to time.
Yeah.
Last word.
I just want to deal with, because there were two really important points made about whether the volunteering bit is made illegitimate if it's just backfilling failures of big government, and the point about metrics. So I agree with Layla in her piece about local government. I think it's very easy to bash local government. It's pretty boring often. It looks pretty municipal and bureaucratic. And I think one of the things, certainly in my part of the world, COVID showed why you need councils. If they didn't exist, we would have invented them. They mobilised, our local councils put together street groups, they distributed the boxes. I mean, it was a civic emergency on a scale I've never seen. And the councils, not the government, the councils did it. And I agree with her about that. Where I perhaps disagree is that I think for a really healthy society, the more we can encourage, help and support, not stigmatise, but help and support people to show the love they have for people in place, to volunteer, the better. And I mean, Trish has just put it more eloquently than I can. There's a little secret about volunteering.
There you go, you see, we really do need to wrap up.
It makes you feel good. And that's the truth, is that giving makes you feel good. And it's linked to mental health, and it's linked to healthy living. Volunteers tend to get out and about and walk around. So my answer to those two questions, firstly, look, there are some things that only government can do. I'm not suggesting that a volunteer force could run the armed forces. I'm not suggesting that GCHQ could be run by volunteers. You know, there's a limit, and there are some things that I'm proud that this country does really well. But as you come down the pyramid of Maslow's hierarchy, government, quite legitimately, for good reasons, is trying to help. We get to a place where we're not very good at it. So we put people in prison, and when we send people out, we give them 48 quid and the clothes they walked in and say, good luck. That is a really, really bad way to expect people not to fall back into reoffending. And it's charities and social enterprises that are doing brilliant work. We spend, you know, it costs more to keep someone in prison than at Eton. I mean, if we invested a little bit of that in social enterprises to help stop people going into prison in the first place, they'd be self-funding. And I think that would be a brilliant way of doing better what government isn't very good at. And on metrics, sir, your point is right. There is a huge wall of money, ESG investing, corporates. It's gone from CSR, yeah, we do a little bit at the weekend, to we're mainstream investing, and they need metrics, which is why I started with that curve. It does come to numbers. If you can say the cost of obesity or the cost of recidivism, offending, alcohol addiction is X, if you can reduce it, we'll let you keep some of the saving. Government can do that. Government's brilliant at totting up money when it suits it. Well, we can equally well tot it up and give it back. And that's a political decision. And I absolutely think that that's why I'm not in the Treasury. And it's absolutely, until we do that, I think it'll all be warm words and exhortations to volunteer. And we'll rely on the 20% of good citizens who do the 80% of the work. If we get the incentives right, 100% of citizens will discover the joy of volunteering.
George, thank you. And thank you to George, and thank you to Taiwo. And thank you to everybody who's contributed. I'm clear that we're starting the right debate. I'm very frustrated we haven't got enough time to get any further in it. But please, if you haven't seen a copy of the paper, take together again. There's a few copies up here. There was some more at the back. Grab it and write to me. Tell me your experiences. Meanwhile, you've got about 15 minutes left to grab a coffee. 2 more final sessions, one in here, one over in Piccolo, health inequalities and safer communities. And thank you for joining us.